My name is Kelly O'Connor. I'm a senior classics major with an anthropology minor at UMass, and this project was an aspect of my senior thesis. So the title of my thesis is The Personal and the Performative, the Archaeology of Marriage in Pre-Roman Central Italy. And the concept behind it is just as wordy and long as my title is. There we go. Okay, so I have a written portion of my thesis and a visual portion of my thesis. And so the purpose of my written portion was to explore what marriage in pre-Roman or Etruscan Central Italy looked like and how we could infer it from a society that does not have a very large surviving literary corpus. And what did marriage mean and what was the purpose of it for these communities? And so I came to the conclusion that marriage was basically a social sexual transaction. And so or at least in elite contexts. So two families would, sometimes from different populations or city centers, sometimes in different ethnic groups, would come together and marry off two people for the purpose of sexual propagation. And so the written portion explored the nuances of that idea, but I needed a visual because since it's it's an alliterate thesis, so I don't use Etruscan writings very much because they're mainly short inscriptions or magic books, and I don't like to use Roman or Greek sources because they're ethnocentric sources, so they're coming at the Etruscans from their own points of view and their own social values, which obscure the motivations of Etruscans. And so I created argument clouds, which is where I focused on 4 specific artifacts from 3 sites in Italy, and I used these to expand upon the visuality and the argumentation of my thesis, because all of these ideas are interconnected because culture is not linear, and I was talking myself in circles when I was trying to explain what my thesis was about, because I can't talk about this artifact without talking about 17 other artifacts. So the first artifact that I talk about in my first section is the Verruccio throne, which is right here, and it's a wooden throne from the first half of the 7th century BCE in Verruccio, Italy, which is in like the northeastern part of the boot. And it's a wooden throne, and on it is a relief of a community engaged in textile production. And so it shows men carding and shearing sheep, it shows women dyeing wool, and it shows women at large standing looms. And so in order to talk about the iconography of weaving and the social implications behind weaving, I had to talk about the weaving kit, which are roquetti, loom weights, and spindle whorls, and the presence of them in archaeological sites and what those mean. I had to talk about other examples of this throne type because it's so common throughout Italy. This one is from Chiusi, which is far more south, and it also shows up as late as the 1st century CE in Rome. And then I had to talk about, in the Greek sphere, what weaving meant to the Greeks as a proxy for what it could mean for the Etruscans. And then also what it looked like in other Etruscan settings. So this is a standing loom and woman spinning wool, and that's a yarn swift. Yes. But the thing is, so this is the Bologna tintinnabulum. She's sitting in the same type of throne that this is, that's the same type of throne that this is, and they're doing the same production in this, and they would be using these things for it. So how do I talk about that without sounding like a crazy person? Because what I wanted to get across is that when a woman is standing at a standing loom, she becomes a facet of the house. She becomes as much a piece of furniture as the loom is, because she cannot move, because you can't move a loom the size of this. And so you can see like, I wanted to show what looms looked like, but also what they could use, and so it got very complicated. But yeah, the main thesis of this chapter was that female virtue in a pre-Christian sense, like duty and fidelity and role in domestic spaces, was directly linked to textile production. And then, oh god. So then my second section of my second chapter was on the Louvre sarcophagus of the spouses, which is from the late 6th century BCE, and it's found in Caire, which is modern-day Trivedi, and that's about an hour north of Rome. And so we're going to be looking at this one more in depth. But this is one of two, it's like a twin. There is one in the Villa Giulia as well. But then there are also many, many more examples of husband and wives in erotic embraces from Etruscan funerary sarcophagi, which, just to clarify, this is actually a cinerary urn, not a sarcophagi in the Egyptian sense. And so when I was talking about what this grave monument meant, I had to talk about, this is in the MFA, different sarcophagi. And this one is a very obvious nude embrace. They are under one blanket. They're under a mantle here, which is a pretty common iconographical note for marriage. They're naked, they're embraced, they're very sexualized, which why are you performing sexual iconography in a funerary monument? And then it doesn't survive in this one, but she would be holding an alabastron, which looks like this, which is a perfume vessel, and she'd be pouring it into the hand of the man behind her. And perfume played a double role as both something you would use when you were embalming a body or preparing a body for burial, but also in the ornamentation for sexual, I don't want to use ritual performance of aristocratic families. And then they're on a cline, which is a type of couch which would be used at banquetings. So this one is the tomb of the triclinium from Tarquinia, and you can see that there's a man and a wife, and a husband and wife, and a husband and wife here, and you can tell by the way they depicted their skin tones. So women are always depicted white because they would be in the house, because they'd be weaving, and men are depicted usually in brown tones or red tones because they would be outside. And then, so along with banqueting comes wine consumption, and specifically in the Louvre example, not in the Villa Giulia example, she's reclining on a wineskin. And so this is a kaiathos from Portici Vitate, which is a site that I work at and my professor runs. And there's a fertility goddess on the wine cup. And so it connects wine consumption and sexual propagation in aristocratic marriages. And so how do you talk about all of these things in a linear way? Which it also has to do with ancestor cults, and you perform or you show sex when you're showing funerals because you got your land and you got your social standing from your parents, and they got it from their parents, and your children will get it from you. So this creates a relationship between the living and the dead for explanations of social standing. And now I'm going to talk about Portici Vitate. So Portici Vitate is a site about half an hour outside of Siena in Etruria, in Tuscany, and this was the site I have the most experience with because my advisor runs the dig. I've been on the dig. Going back to the dig, I've had to read trench books from the 60s, which was awful. But there's a series of four frieze plaques from the archaic structure, which is early 6th century BCE. And there's this one, which is the procession frieze plaque. There's a horse race frieze plaque. There's a banqueting frieze plaque, and there is a seated figures frieze plaque, which I'll talk about. But these frieze plaques are super controversial because we don't know exactly how they were displayed, or we can't be certain because the building was systematically destroyed. And so a lot of these were found in debris pits. But the iconography of both the plaques themselves, how the plaques interact with each other, and how they interact with the building itself is super important for its interpretation, because a lot of people want to say that this scene is a scene going to the underworld, like this one is. But this scene and some other ones have fantastic qualities to them. So this is a vamp, which is a winged woman who is a psychopomp. So she carts people off to the dead and off to the underworld. But it's a couple under a parasol in a cart, and this is a couple under a parasol on a cart. So people are like, oh, like it's a procession towards the dead. But that doesn't make sense when you look at the rest of the iconography. So the two female attendants, and you can tell they're females by the indications of breasts, are holding fans. And this is a fan. And fans were a marker of high social status in the Mediterranean throughout its entire ancient history. There are examples from the Assyrian Empire of kings being fanned because it gets really hot down there. And so when you have someone to fan you, it shows that you're pretty rich. So, and then this is called a situla, and this is an example of what a bronze one looks like. And these are most common in northern Italy, Austria, and the northern Balkans, but they would be used to house yarn and weaving equipment. And then that ties in really nicely to this, which was recently suggested by Adriana in the back, that it is a yarn swift, which is, you can see right here, this is an umbrella one, and this is actually in the mead, so relevant. But you would use this to both create balls of yarn, like this woman is holding, and you can see down here, which that's a conical case for yarn, and this is a conical case for yarn. Or you could use it to dress a standing loom. And so my argument is that this is the arrival of a bride due to both the mantle she's wearing, which calls back to the husband and wife sarcophagus, and the presence of weaving equipment, which, as we saw with the Verruccio throne, is an intrinsic part of what an aristocratic woman's duty and obligation would be as a new feature of her household. And then finally, the last object I talk about is the seated figures frieze plaque from the same series. And so this one is also one of the more controversial ones, because people in the past have suggested that it is a Hyrios Gamos, which is what we see right here, and it's the mythological wedding between two deities. In this case, it is Hera and Zeus, which this just intrinsically cannot be Hera and Zeus because we're in Etruria and they had their own sets of gods. But as you can see, she's opening her veil to the side, which Hera is doing, which is a pretty universal gesture in Greece and Etruria for a bride. We even do that today when we lift the bride. We lift the veil off the bride's head. So that securely situates her as a bride. And as you can see, she's sitting in the exact same throne type as the Verruccio throne is. And there have been arguments made that the Verruccio throne was a dowry gift. And as we could see in other examples, women would sit in these thrones while they're weaving. Also, just a side note, they're just called cylindrical thrones. The word throne doesn't have the same connotations in this context as it does today. And then, as we can see, they again have fans. And this is the Tomb of the Shields from Tarquinia. And you can see a man and a woman at a banquet reclining with a fan. So it's very reminiscent of husband and wife sarcophagus. And then this man holds a lituus, which is this thing. And that was a common marker of social and religious and political authority in Etruria, and you can still see that today with bishops' crooks. They're literally lituuses. Like, I found a picture of one from Caire from like the 5th century BCE and one on sale today that are exactly the same. But as you can see here, this is a man with a lituus. This is the tomb of the augur because he's dividing the future based on birds. But there are no birds in this scene, so it can't be augury. And so it's my opinion that this is the marriage and that it would be these two who are getting married because they are the ones of the highest social status. And now I can show you how I managed to make all of this make sense in a visual way. So I worked with the head of mathematics and computer science at the Poggio Civitate Archaeological Field School, which sounds really fancy, but he's just my friend Cole. And he is the main coder for Poggio Civitate, and he developed this code as a deconstructed reconstruction, which is where you can explain arguments behind reconstructions of archaeological sites, because when you see an image of a site, it's not what it looked like, it's what the excavators are arguing it could have looked like. And so I'm going to use the sarcophagus of the spouses as an example to show you what I did. So all of these little circles are argument clouds. So if you click on this one talks about sex and death and the connection of ancestor cults and why it's appropriate to show erotic imagery in funeral environments. And so if you go down here, this is the Villa Giulia sarcophagus of the spouses, and as you can see, it's very similar to the one at the Louvre. This is one from the MFA, which shows a man and woman reclining, and this is actually the sarcophagus of the male child of this couple. So their inscriptions link them together as 2 generations of a family from Volsci, and so you can see right there the ideology behind this practice. And I have a little blurb here about what this means, and you can link out to an article that talks about the 2 MFA examples more in depth. Then I talked about the perfume and talked about the connections between sex and death and perfume. And so this is an example of a smaller cinerary urn that saves the alabastron, it survives. This is the Etruscan goddess Turin, which is about the equivalent to Aphrodite, but she's holding an alabastron and she's naked, so sexy. And then there's one about the wineskin and the connection between wine, which this is what a modern wineskin looks like because I've never seen one before, and the connection of wine to Eastern fertility deities. So this is Ishtar from Babylonia, which is one of the oldest examples of this type of fertility divinity, and this is the vessel from Poggio Civitate that shows a similar fertility goddess on a wine vessel. And finally, this one is on banquets. So this is the Poggio Civitate banqueting frieze plaque, which is very reminiscent of both the husband and wife sarcophagus and the tomb of the triclinium, and this one is Neo-Assyrian, and you can see this is one of the earliest examples of a man reclining at a banquet. His wife is sitting in front of him and he's being fed on either side. So this allowed me to give more holistic visual representations and show the interconnections between seemingly distinct facets of the artifacts. And that's all I have time for. Questions, comments?
How large is this? Because you said it's a cinerary urn.
This is more than life size. So this is ginormous. We aren't sure if there was one person in it, if there were two people in it, because it was found in like the 19th century, so records are sketchy, the ashes don't survive. But yeah, it's ginormous.
So are you going, like, is this going to be hosted somewhere to be like viewed by the general public?
So right now I'm working on digitizing my thesis with Professor Paler, because my goal is to be able to link out from my thesis into these images, and publishing this would require publishing my thesis, which, as my professor has so graciously told me, is nowhere near publication ready. So right now, no, but in the future, this was also like a dry run for this tool, because it was developed last summer. But in the future, the Matata excavation and hopefully other people will be able to use this technology to be able to non-linearly explain iconography or whatever.
Kelly, in traditional archaeological publication, one of the things that people do is that they spend a lot of time and energy laying out a catalog that's going to sit at the back of their work. And what you've done is you've kind of more seamlessly integrated those things. How does this, as the author of this, and then the reader of many of those traditional publications, what are your reflections on trying to innovate in kind of archaeological narrative?
Well, I personally hate plates, which is a lot of times what the images are called, because you'll be reading and it'll be like, see figure 1, and then 2 sentences later it'll see plate 7, and they'll be in different places and there'll be different types of things, and you can't, like, what I like about this is that I can look at this and choose what comparanda I wish to explore. So I can just as easily explore the tomb of the triclinium as I can the Bulci sarcophagi. And I think it's a much more straightforward approach that isn't linear, if that makes sense. Because this allows for, like, you don't have to flip through books. These are colored images, most of them are high resolution. You don't have to look at like grainy black and white photos that were taken in like the 60s. Yeah, I much prefer this method, but this method is hard because it has to be digital. You can't print it out, which, as someone who has 30 books checked out from the 5 college libraries for my thesis, I used a lot of physical copies, and I also used a lot of digital copies, and like I think people are not super inclined to change in academia, and so the goal of this was to make a technology to work specifically with academic publishing, not create a technology and then be like, figure out what to do with it yourself. Yeah, I like this one better. Carly?
So I'm wondering if like accessibility was something that came into your like making this, because for me, like, I'm not an archaeology person, but this makes a lot of sense, whereas like reading a like very scholarly article about these artifacts, I think I would struggle with. So I'm wondering if that is something that like motivated you, or if it's just like a byproduct of your project.
I think definitely before I started doing this, we had thesis meetings, and a lot of times the questions I got asked were, what does this look like? Can I have a picture of this? Some of those questions were specifically asked by you. But I think this does make things much more accessible, because you can also look, like some of my things are less widely published, which like artifacts being published is also a super big problem, because Italian museums have like hoards in their basements of things that have never been published that they refuse to let anyone else look at because they may want to publish it on it one day. But yeah, so this offers a variety of artifacts temporally, spatially, and visually, which I don't think you would get with just a straightforward publication about the husband and wife sarcophagus.
You were careful to note that the lituus that was in the frieze plaque was not in the context of augury. I guess it's kind of like two-parted, where one, what is the significance of a lituus in a marital context? And then two, is there kind of a way that you can use the new digital information that you're putting out to kind of keep honing on this point of a repetition of a lituus in marriage depictions?
Yeah, so on the first point, one of my professor's favorite quotes is that the dead don't bury themselves. And so whoever is burying the deceased is doing so with intention and with specific goals in mind. So people did not spend all of the time, energy, and resources making a more than life-size cinerary urn for no reason. And so I think the lituus probably in graves was meant to show that A, they could afford to put metal objects in the graves, and metal objects have transferable value. So this you cannot melt down and change into anything else. It is stagnant, but metal is not. And so it was a way, for like economic showing off, and then also putting a lituus and burying most likely a man with a lituus reflects not only what the man was in life, but what his relatives gained from who he was in life. So the people burying the dead do so in order to reflect back on themselves and convey messages about themselves, not necessarily about the people buried. And for the repetition of litui in burials, it's like you can use comparandum more with this method. There are not a lot of examples of physical litui because they'd be metal, or if they were wood, they would have decomposed. But they are present on some wall paintings and some reliefs. So you could even choose like the shoes here, and because Etruscans were very famous for their shoes, and go off and exploring that. So I think this method is really good for specific like question paths. Multiple ones in different directions. Colin?
I'll try to make it quick, but the standards for cataloging cultural objects in specifically online databases are usually, in my experience, pretty sloppy and inelegant when it comes to drawing relationships between different cultural objects. So could you imagine a system like this, which you've designed specifically to demonstrate and clarify the iconography of one image, but could you see this being used to sort of link together multiple objects in an online catalog?
Yeah, I think that'd be really useful to do in museums and then also among museums, because a lot of times you can't go like this one is in France, its twin is in Italy, and the ones from Bolgi are in Boston. So they're very spread out, and so one who was less well versed in Etruscan cinerary urns would not know necessarily about the other ones. And so I think that'd be really useful. And I think that would also be useful of stopping museums showing items outside of their contexts and outside of their cultural significance. So if you just went to the Louvre and you just saw this, that would be it. You wouldn't know like what it meant to the Etruscans, how it interacted with other artifacts, how it interacted with its tomb, and how it's reflected in other populations. So I think it's a very useful way to get out of the headspace of classical masterpieces, which is super problematic, and also artifacts in glass boxes.